In St. Alphonsus' book on the victories and triumphs of the martyrs, he says towards the beginning that the martyrs received their great courage in their sufferings from their desire of quickly arriving at the fulfillment of the promises made by our Lord to his followers, a promise which they always kept in mind. Blessed are ye when they shall revile you and persecute you. Our Lord continues, be glad and rejoice, for your reward is very great in heaven. That's the virtue of hope, to which fortitude is connected very greatly, the great virtue of the martyrs. Now today we honor a very great martyr, Saint Hermenegild. I don't think he is honored enough by us, but he is really a saint for our day. His father, McGuire, they have some very complicated names, he raised Hermenegild and his brother in the Arian faith right from the beginning. But Hermenegild himself for a time did actually profess the Arian heresy, but he married a very nice and a very zealous Catholic, and she had to endure very poor treatment from McGuire's second wife, but nevertheless she kept her faith very strictly and set such a good example that eventually Saint Hermenegild converted to Catholicism. And this, of course, greatly offended his father, who is still a very zealous Arian. So his father immediately divested him of his title of king, and then he planned to take away his possessions, his wife, who was a princess, and even his life, unless he continued to profess Arianism. Now, Hermenegild, he was a prince now, remember, he rose up against his father. He tried to get all of these armies together. He first went to Catholic Spain. They supported him, but they didn't have the manpower to defend him against the Arians, so he had to look elsewhere. He went to Constantinople and looked for support there, but they could not help him because they were already at war with others, with Persia, I believe it was. So finally, he found some Roman generals in that area, and they had a small army. And he asked them for their assistance. They promised with an oath to help him. But they did betray him and their promise when Hermenegild's father bought them out. Eventually, Hermenegild had absolutely nowhere to go for support, so he went to a certain church in Spain where he took refuge at the foot of the altar. Now, his father would not dare to enter that Catholic church, so he sent Hermenegild's brother to go in and speak with him. And so he did, and his brother promised that if Hermenegild, if he should come out of the church and ask forgiveness from his father, that his father would then restore to him all of his honors. So the loving son trusted his father's promise. He had no reason to believe otherwise. So he walked out of the church and knelt down at his father's feet, and he didn't receive any forgiveness, but rather he was stripped of his royal robes and then loaded with chains. And they then took him to prison. And this is where the very famous history of our saint truly begins. His father, the Arian, kept trying, by threats and promises both, to make him give up his Catholic faith. But his answer was always the same. If you ever get into a little religious debate, it's good to stick to the same point every time, until they can actually answer it. And that's what St. Hermenegild did. Though his father kept many times and in many different ways by promises and threats, his answer was always this: I'm ready to lose my scepter and even my life rather than abandon the divine truth which I have finally found. Now, Alban Butler, who wrote the Butler's Lives of the Saints, of course, said that the prison was to Hermenegild a school of virtue. Rather than becoming depressed like many of us would, humanly speaking, and complaining against the injustice of it all, he added penance. He wore a sackcloth and many other penances, and he prayed constantly for perseverance. Easter came, and the Arian bishop was sent by Hermenegild's father to bring the valid Holy Eucharist with the message that if only Hermenegild would receive it at the hands of this Arian bishop, then he would be restored to all of his dignities. All he had to do was to receive Holy Communion. But Hermenegild rebuked the bishop, saying that, well, this Holy Eucharist was sacrificed in a sacrilegious Mass, which was offered outside the Catholic Church. I cannot take part in any of this. Just as the Jews of old would not partake of certain foods that were offered in false sacrifices of the pagans. They would not do it. So also with this great saint. I always like to ask questions in my sermons, putting you and me into the place of the martyr. If that were you, and you knew that this sacrament brought to you was truly the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, would you have received from this Arian bishop to save your life, to save your honors, to save your everything else that you have in this life? Well, he would not, because he understood that Holy Communion is the sign of unity that exists between Christ and the Pope and the faithful. To receive Holy Communion from someone in union with a pope, for example, would be a false pope, for example, would be to put yourself in union with that false pope. And in his case, he would have put himself in union with the Arian heresy. So immediately when the bishop returned and said that it was of no use, Hermenegild wouldn't budge, the father sent right away some men to dispatch his son. They walked boldly right into the prison, and they cleft his skull, and he died a martyr. Whenever we come across the life of a martyr, it's good to remember, especially that whenever we are in trials, it's good to practice the same virtues that the martyrs did. They remembered first and foremost the promises of Christ to those who suffer. Secondly, to remember the crown that awaits us. Think of the 40 holy martyrs of Sebastian, the angel holding that one last crown. Or to think of the suffering Christ who willingly endured them all for you. But above all, in moments of suffering, this is very important. We must pray to remain faithful. Just briefly, there is this story of a man who was almost a martyr, but was not. He suffered for the faith for quite a long time in many horrible sufferings, but at the last moment, he gave up. He turned against the faith, and moments later he died, an apostate. And the saints tell us that the reason that he did not persevere was simply this, that he was not praying during all of his sufferings. It is essential to pray in suffering because we can't carry the cross on our own. We need the grace of God, and that comes through prayer. So your thought for today might be this: to make your prison, that is your sufferings and the sufferings of your state in life, make them a school of virtue. Let your pains and your crosses be that school of virtue that teaches you patience, but above all, that teaches you your dependence upon God in moments of suffering. If you kneel down, we'll say a prayer to St. Hermenegild.